to the first episode of a series, the Soil Carbon Removal Think Tank. In this series, we bring together a number of leading experts in the fields of soil carbon removal and the voluntary carbon market. And what we're aiming to do is to bring clarity on key issues. Many of us here have been part of the journey of development of regenerative agriculture over the last couple of years, and also of the developing carbon markets. And we all know that we're marrying two highly complex tasks: nature and global coordination of climate change. And while this is undoubtedly complex, we also know that we're not starting from scratch. There is a really good common understanding of both regenerative agriculture and what constitutes trustworthy carbon markets. So what we want to do in this series is to choose these very complex topics within sort of, the overlap of regenerative agriculture and carbon markets, and identify in conversation with experts which topics we have full agreement on so we can move forward together, and in which open topics we still have open questions maybe that we should discuss further. The aim here is to bring it to an essence, basically to make it as simple as possible, but never more simple than that. So with that being said, I'd like to start our conversation just with a bit of framing what we're talking about. We all know agriculture currently contributes about 30% of greenhouse gas globally. In Europe, it's about 10%. What we definitely need to do is reduce our emissions from the agricultural sector to reach what we have set out to do, that is to reach the Paris goals. However, agriculture is one of the few sectors that can go beyond mere climate neutrality or sort of reduced emissions. Soils are what we call carbon sinks, that is storage of carbon. So our soils in the past centuries have lost significant amounts of carbon, and we can restore that carbon back to the soils, pulling it out of the atmosphere again. We have different projections about the feasibility of this, but the capacity of soils to hold carbon is large enough to potentially reverse climate change if, of course, we also drastically reduce emissions. Though that potentially it really is awesome in the literal sense of the word, there's much more. Agriculture is currently practiced on about 1/3 of the globe's land surface. And through that, farmers influence all natural cycles, whether that's carbon, whether that's water, biodiversity, nutrients. Agriculture has a massive influence on our natural capital. At the same time, agriculture is very influenced by everything that is happening in the world, whether that is rising fuel costs. Right now, we see a crisis of fertilizer costs that have been rising, or changing weather patterns, or also the social image of farmers. While farmers have always acted as stewards of the land historically, we really, over the last decades, have educated and incentivized farmers out of it into maximizing yield. Today, we live in a world where 1/3 of the global produce is discarded because it can't be transported to the consumer in time. We produce billions in externalized costs, and farming as a profession has one of the highest suicide rates at all. So we need to turn this around, and we can turn this around. This is the very positive part. Regenerative agriculture is, as we put it, about closing leaky buckets, closing loops, creating more circularity within the farm. It helps farmers to use natural processes, to optimize the farm operations, and to create much more beneficial settings, both for the farmer, for nature as a whole, for climate, for us as a society. Yet, what we also know, all of us that have been working in the field of regenerative agriculture, is that we're still missing essential infrastructure for it to scale. Climate Farmers is working on building that infrastructure for industry and for policy to transition to regenerative methods at scale. And why we are talking here today is because we really need to get common understandings of what regenerative agriculture can contribute, how we can make that possible, and sort of what are the processes, what are the technologies, what are the methodologies that are needed in order to do that. So today's event is all about the transition towards regenerative agriculture and the role of the voluntary carbon market in it. We've all seen so much activity over the last couple of months, the last year, the last 2 years, in sort of carbon credits coming from agriculture. And we need to bring this to a common understanding. Though I'm today's moderator, I'll already say that I'm not really unbiased. As climate farmers, we are creating what we call carbon plus credits, which are high quality certificates, which optimize both for farm resilience and co-benefits. Looking at, on the one hand, carbon, but then also what we look at for full sort of regeneration. There's primary productivity, water purification, provision of habitat for biodiversity, cycling, and provision of nutrients. So this is a topic that sort of matters to us, but it also matters to sort of the entire sector to gain more and more clarity on it. Now, without much further ado, let us begin the conversation. Can the voluntary carbon market finance the transition to regenerative agriculture? And I would first of all like to introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today. First, Nelly de Gobul, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, who is a sustainability and communication specialist who currently manages the Economist Impact Sustainability Project and the World Ocean Initiative. Welcome. And Mateusz Jasnocha, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is a regenerative farmer on 700 hectares from northern Poland, and the co-founder and CEO of European Carbon Farmers. Other than that, Mateusz is also actively involved in the work of the UNFCCC's COP26 Climate Champions, where he served as the Regenerative Agriculture Fellow, the Economy of Francisco's Agriculture and Justice Village, and he was working at EIT Food, where he managed the Regenerative Agriculture program in Poland. So really, really looking forward to this conversation. And I would say, let's jump right in, if you're ready for it. So maybe, Nelly, I'm really curious, from the work that you've done with the sustainability project at the Economist Impact, can you tell us more about what you have found about the value, not only sort of sustainability, but of regeneration for us as a society?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me, Ivo. You know, I'm definitely not a regenerative agriculture expert as you and Mateusz are, but regenerative agriculture and regenerative systems in general is such a hot topic, I guess I should say. But obviously, it's so much more than a trend. And so in my work at Economist Impact, we work really closely with quite large companies who are trying to figure out, you know, how do we best approach net zero strategies? Like how do we do this? Is it carbon offsets? Is it carbon credits? And those nature-based solutions are becoming more and more popular. You know, people are trying to figure out how do we tap into those carbon markets and those credits that do have those co-benefits. So it's not just about carbon, it's about really investing in the environment, and also the S in ESG, so the sort of the community around it. And that's where I really see regenerative agriculture and the potential to for carbon markets and regenerative agriculture to come together. And I think that the carbon market system really is a necessary finance mechanism for regenerative agriculture, especially if we need to scale it in the way that we do. I mean, not just for food. It's really interesting, and it's so timely that this conversation is happening, because recently we interviewed Claire Bergkamp, who is the COO of Textile Exchange, which is an NGO working to implement sustainable practices in the fashion and textiles industry. And she was also the sustainability director for Stella McCartney, so she's sort of deep in that world. And, you know, we think about regenerative agriculture for food, of course, like that makes sense. But what about, you know, all of the other things that we grow, quote unquote? So, you know, cotton, textiles, fabrics, and they're working incredibly hard to make that standard practice for fashion supply chains. But of course, right now it's still very niche, and they're trying to figure that out. So it's, I mean, in everything. Personally, I do believe that regenerative agriculture should be standardized. I mean, obviously, you know, there's sort of three big points on why it's so important. I mean, obviously the carbon benefits that regenerative agriculture give us and the environmental benefits, but it's really a transition. It's a massive shift back towards something that people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, like really going back to traditional agricultural practices that respect the land and see it all as this really complex and integrated system. And I keep thinking of, you know, when I think about regenerative agriculture, I think about permaculture, I think about, you know, everything benefits each other. It really replicates, you know, natural system, just the way that everything in nature is connected to each other. And so that to me is really exciting. It's like it's a whole mindset shift of industrial agriculture and exploiting the land and, you know, taking as much as we can out of it and then moving on to the next maybe fertile plot because we've taken too much out of here, so it doesn't work anymore. And all of the issues that go on with that. And it's this mindset shift again back to those practices that Indigenous communities have been doing for years. And again, sort of the second thing that I find really exciting about regenerative agriculture is that by nature, it can't really be exploited, right? Like you can't, the whole point about it is making that land that farmers steward as productive as possible in so many different ways, and that's so exciting. And then again, you know, I think obviously there's so many environmental benefits of regenerative agriculture, but I think there can be really quantifiable sort of community and social benefits as well. I think that when you think about how different again regenerative farming is to traditional farming, I think it tends to lend itself to more bringing in sort of community voices and really understanding supply chains on a more personal level. And perhaps I'm wrong, you know, I'd really like to hear Mattis's opinion on that. But so yes, it's really interesting, and I'm really curious to see how voluntary carbon markets can help again sort of scale regenerative agriculture and standardize it, but also in a way that goes beyond sort of that carbon tunnel vision that I think companies who are trying to figure out their net zero strategies get kind of stuck in, is like, okay, well how is this just going to reduce my carbon? Like, how can I offset my carbon? And I'm hoping that it can be embraced in a more holistic way. But yeah, I'd love to hear Mattis's thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought there were a couple of points that I think are so important. On the one hand, this mindset shift, right, that also goes much beyond agriculture. Like we're working in a degenerative mindset throughout, in an extractive mindset throughout what we're doing, right? Like we're trying to exploit resources, right? Whether that is sort of often people in companies or whether that is other resources, and the search for how can we as society, as an economy, become regenerative and improve the resources that we're working with, I think is so, on the one hand, so important, and on the other hand, so inspiring and so possible. We're asking ourselves a lot the question at Climate Farmers: what is a regenerative work culture, right? Like how do you, how do we help ourselves grow while we're working, and how do we ensure that what we're working on sort of helps us grow? And the second thing I thought that was really important is this point of like we can create so much more value than only carbon, right? Like, which is why we often we avoid the term carbon farming and talk about regenerative agriculture, because it really encompasses all of that. Because yes, we have a value of carbon capture, but then, for example, just rainwater infiltration, right? It's a topic that is completely ignored. But in Germany last year in autumn, we had 2 days of rain, very, very heavy rainfall in Western Germany. 30 billion in costs from inundations of houses, etc., in 2 days of rain. Not that agriculture can cover all of that, but we do create sort of a buffer by fields that can actually absorb rainwater. So there's so much more value that is being created there. Matthias, I'm so curious about your take on this, because incredibly, aside from all the other things you do, you and your family, you're also active farmers on 700 hectares, no less. At some point in the last, I think, 1 or 2 decades, your family has taken a decision to switch and to approach your land management differently. And I'm really curious about sort of what what caused that, and what were the effects that you've seen. Also, of course, all the thoughts on what Nelly has said before.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Nelly. Like, I'm sure I won't be able to cover all the points that come to mind as we are like here, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A at the end, and so glad to see so many familiar faces here and also meet new friends as well. Thank you for all the messages in the chat. It's just crazy. So a few points to mention from my end, providing like some perspective on the questions we are exploring. As farmers, we have transitioned since 2004 onwards for a very simple reason. Poland was entering the EU or entered the EU, and therefore we were bound by the CAP, Common Agriculture Policy of the EU, which was a tremendous change and opportunity for our farm to basically follow the policy. And it turned out that we started to farm firstly in a sustainable way and now in regenerative way, as we understand, rooted very much, as you, Ivo, have been explaining in the presentation, also Nelly was mentioning her first remarks, in the concept of ecosystem and being a steward of that ecosystem rather than, you know, being the owner of that land and unconsciously exploiting it, to you know, being a conscious steward. What I would like to say is that we didn't transform the farm because we were conscious first. We've transformed the farm because there was a necessity slash opportunity slash privilege of following the Common Agriculture Policy that took us to the way in which we are in right now. And now looking back, we are like, wow, we are regenerative farmers. We've done all those things. Did we know that we are doing those things of such profound importance when we were doing that? No. Why we were doing that? Because we were looking at the money. We were knowing our cost levels, we were knowing our revenue streams, and we had set an outlook on both input side prices and our ability to affect those, which is very limited, next to none, and commodity prices, which is also very limited, you know, next to none in terms of affecting that. So we were like, how can we better the financial situation? And I would be putting on the table this question of financial literacy as we are talking about regenerative agriculture and all those topics that we are talking about. So synthesizing, I think our family's story and this question that we have on the table are like very complementary, meaning, can voluntary carbon markets serve regenerative agriculture? Surely yes, that's why we are here, right? That's why we are exploring this question, that's why we care. Will they? We don't know. I know you, Ivo, Nelly, I guess everyone in here is wanting to make sure what he or she can and what we collectively can to make sure this is the case. And then I would offer a point that as, you know, voluntary carbon markets develop, with us working together for the benefit of the farmer and regeneration, exploring sometimes very tough challenges and ethical dilemmas together, I see voluntary carbon markets in that space speaking more and more with regulated markets and the common agriculture policy or the agriculture policy of the EU, because I think this is the scope of conversation we are having here, aligning more with the climate policy and objectives of the European Union, mainly net zero by 2050 and significant reduction by 2030. And for that, just like the CAP enabled Poland and Polish agriculture to really make tremendous change since 2004 till today in terms of where we are as agriculture, the CAP has to evolve, from my perspective and European carbon farmers' perspective, from action-based payments, in which we are in right now, which are basically not speaking very well with the climate policy and the way we are measuring that, to result-based payments. And I would propose that we center those on soil carbon maintenance and enhancement, so that the climate policy is married or connected with and speaks well with the agriculture policy. Happy to report a lot of work in that space is happening. I know you guys are working on that. We are working on that. Many other people and great organizations, including many of you in this call, are working on that. So this is happening, but it can go south, right? The question is, not the question, but like the reality at hand is, we know it can fail, and therefore let's make sure it doesn't fail. So carbon markets as such, therefore, are not well developed. We are at the beginning stages of bringing that to the farmers, and voluntary carbon markets are not the solution itself. It is a stage as we are connecting that with regulation, and in particular the CAP. That was long, but I stop here.
Wonderful. I think super interesting points, and I think it's, as you say, it's an interesting example how sort of in your family's case, sort of this this system of the CAP has enabled you to make that switch, and sort of it's maybe a really interesting blueprint to look at how the carbon markets could do something similar. I think you said something really important there towards the end, sort of it could, right, like it could be very effective, but we need to make sure that it doesn't go south. And I would like to explore that a bit. What is sort of needed from us as participants in this market to create a trustworthy market, to make sure that, you know, not only today we can sort of funnel funds from the markets to the farmers, but sort of that market grows in trust and creates more capital for farmers over time. And I'm curious about both of your thoughts on, like, what do we as market participants have to make sure of in order to, you know, create trustworthy markets? Maybe Nelly, would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, Matthias, you made so many absolutely interesting and what I believe are accurate points. And first of all, I think marrying, like, we can't think about voluntary carbon markets as like a silver bullet solution or in isolation or as part of a vacuum at all. Like, it has to work with policy instruments, it has to work with existing governance, otherwise it will fail. But a bigger part of that, I think, is really bringing in the voices of farmers like Matthias yourself and farmers on the ground, and really understanding what the incentives and financial supports that they actually need to deliver on those returns that carbon markets would expect. I also think it's so difficult in terms of actually quantifying and verifying the carbon returns in regenerative agriculture because of its complexity. I used to work for a company that was exploring this in reforestation, and obviously there's a lot of with reforestation projects. There's REDD+, and you know, they are trading on the carbon markets. But when I would talk to foresters specifically about the UK Woodland Carbon Code, they weren't consulted in a way that really made sense to them. And talking about financial literacy, Matthias, as you mentioned, like, they didn't even quite understand. It wasn't clear how to apply. There was no real support from the government. Like, so it turned out that a lot of the foresters that I was talking to, it's like, no one's really involving in this because it's too much faff basically for the forester, who has so many other things to think about. So I think there has to be more of an open dialogue, and people who want to sort of broker these markets and offer these types of credits, which have these co-benefits, which people, I think, and companies, again, are really interested in exploring, more so than just credits that are taken from like an energy plant or a solar power plant. And they're premium credits as well. So I think there has to be much more consultation with people, actually farmers on the ground, farmers who don't know anything about regenerative agriculture, farmers who are already doing these types of practices. So I think there has to be more investment in the research and ways to really quantify those carbon measurements. And obviously it will differ per region, it will differ within regions, depending on what type of soil you're farming, depending on the climatic conditions. So there has to be the sort of the data and the science and the research element. There has to be the consultation with the people who are actually doing this, and then the policy and governance support as well.
Thank you. Mateusz, I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
So there are many, but I think only one to share, because the topic is incredibly connected. I don't want to say it's super complex, but it's very connected within itself and with so many other topics, right? So what best we can do in order to move this conversation forward as much as we can is to keep it simple. To point Nelly mentioned, if you go into narration, you can be saying, oh, I'm not regenerative farmer, I'm regenerative farmer, whatever. If we bring it at least one, if not more levels of complexity lower, which of course has a risk with itself, but is useful, and we are talking about carbon farming, not regenerative agriculture, then my thesis is that every single farmer, whether he or she knows it, whether she or he likes it or not, is a carbon farmer, because you do have you have carbon cycle in your ecosystem, whether you like it or not. The thing is, most of the farmers don't know it, or they don't think about it the same way, and very few are actually measuring what they are doing, right? Like just name a few tools that you can use, Cool Farm Tool, for example, or Farm Carbon Calculator, free to use, not perfect, but good starting points for knowing where you are. So I would be saying that let's keep it as, like, let's bring it back to the common points on which we can agree, because I don't know any farmer in any part of the world, and I've been very privileged to basically be all around the world visiting farmers, some of whom are in this call. None of the farmers I know, whether he identifies himself as regenerative or super conventional or agribusiness, wants to destroy the land that his farm and livelihood is dependent on. So it's very important to keep that in mind. And then final thing to say, action over everything. Like, it's super important to talk, to synthesize, to, as we are doing that, to be doing like interludes and be basically saying, okay, we agreed on this, we can already be doing so much. Yes, we still have some action items to like conceptualize and test and be doing once we test and validate those, but we can be doing already so many things, right? Like lowering tillage, introducing cover crops, and it's a matter of there are big similarities between energy and industry and agriculture. The challenge with agriculture is that you have a lot of small players who need to take some decisions and changes at farm level, right? In energy, you have big players who, if they change, the system changes pretty quickly. In agriculture, we have the numbers problems of how do you get that to not 50 farmers, because we do have 50 regenerative farmers in Poland. We have many more than that. We do have way more than 50 in Germany, in Portugal, in Spain, in France. But how do you get that to 50,000, right? And how do you get that to all? And whether we will be using the term regenerative agriculture in 20 years time, in 10 years time, when we live in that future, I think yes, but I may be wrong. It's not important. The important thing is to bring that knowledge, ideally in farmer to farmer level, and align that with financial mechanisms that we have, voluntary carbon credits being part of that, may very likely important at first, and then with policy. And then maybe one day, getting to a world in which we are not paying subsidies, but we are having result-based payments, in which the regulator is just creating a market for private players to chip in with their own money, and we don't have this race that we are having of private sector seeing a huge opportunity, and rightly so, in that space, rushing, and then regulator also rightly so being more thoughtful and taking more time to develop certain mechanisms, which then may not merge at the end, and we are back in square zero, if not -1, when this process is completed.
So many interesting points, so many good points. I think there's to this point of, are we going to still use the term regenerative agriculture in however many years, right? Like, sort of back to Nelly's point from before, or also Mateusz, that you said, we were just doing agriculture, and by now we realize what we're doing has a regenerative effect. And I think over time, or what we should be aiming to is, this is just agriculture. How, like, creating a kind of agriculture where not by intention, but by accident, the natural resources such as carbon that you're building on are reduced. Well, does not seem like good business, right? It's sort of the same thing as we are more and more figuring out about non-agricultural business, that burning through your employees is not a good idea. It's not good business, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in that. So I think over time, we're just going to get to this is good agricultural practice that we're talking about here. I would like to get back to one more point that you said before. So how do we make sure that we sort of don't go to square -1? Because something that I'm a bit worried about in the carbon markets is, we've seen that with tree planting, right? Like we see so many climate initiatives planting trees, and honestly, we have lost credibility there, right? Like we don't really trust all of these tree planting initiatives anymore, and for good reasons, because often it isn't done, looking at context, looking at sort of the right kind of trees in the right kind of place, making sure that these trees still stand in many years. And there have been sort of let's say darker sheep in this space, basically making it really simple and probably with good intention. What we're seeing a lot in the agriculture space is that we have a lot of influx of initiatives working there, again with very good intentions. And I mean, Matthias, you have been very close to it in the COP conversations. What we're doing here, so the voluntary carbon markets and generally emission avoidance, emission reduction, is part of let's say a much bigger plan, right? It's part of a much bigger initiative that is a very complicated and intricate cooperation between public and private sectors. And there is a need for us to use that tool well, right? Like we have these carbon markets, and there is this need for sort of clear communication of how have we quantified that amount of carbon, how sort of what other aspects have we taken into account, talking about additionality, talking about permanence, talking about sort of proper registering the certificates, and making sure that we actually don't double count and double claim. And this is something where I'm thinking a lot about how can we make that available to actors in the system, because as climate farmers, we have gone through that rabbit hole, as we call it, in the last 1 and 2 years of diving deep into the complexities of the carbon markets. And wow, that is complex. That is not something that you figure out easily. That is not something that most actors are going to be willing to do, to really create high quality carbon markets following ISO certified methodology and doing that transparently. So I think a question that we as a sector also need to ask ourselves is, given that many actors are going to come in, and that is a positive thing, how do we make sure that they manage to navigate the complexities of this space and really create high quality carbon certificates that are sort of high quality in the sense of they can be traded, they benefit farmers in the best way possible, and also they take into account more than just carbon. They really look at the whole ecosystem. I'm just curious, do you have thoughts on that? Like, how can we sort of enable more actors to do the great work that they really want to do?
If I may jump in really Please. Quickly, it's so interesting. Obviously, in my line of work, it's almost sort of like a massive communications challenge, right? And I think, I don't know where, obviously working in media, we can do our best to kind of try and explain these to more of a general public, but I think that communication breakdown happens when, like I mentioned before, sort of governments try and implement policies that are supposed to help farmers or foresters without actually talking with them or making a real effort to help share that knowledge and really and helping people who are directly involved understand how can they themselves then benefit from something like a voluntary carbon market. I'm really excited by the science-based target initiative for nature, because I think that will really help bring trust around this conversation, even though it won't directly be involved in sort of creating verified carbon credits. But I think there will be things that can be taken from that framework, and there'll be standard bodies like the Gold Standard and Vera who will work with the Science-Based Targets initiatives around this to create those more robust and trusted carbon credits from regenerative agriculture projects. Yeah, so I think that's my little hot take on that.
looking at the frameworks that are out there that can be used.
Yeah.
If I may build on that, few major points are building precise on what Nelly said, and I'm sorry for making it boring by agreeing with most of the things, but that's the thing. At a farmer level, at SBTI for carbon for nature, other venues, including COP26, I'm sure COP27 will be the same, UN Food Systems Summit, there's so much happening, right? And I saw many times there's this tendency at some point to say, oh, like nothing is in place, right? Which is not the case at all. There's so much happening, but like when you take DG Agri, Directorate General Agri, and DG Klima, Directorate General Climate at the European Union level, and you take the example of the Polish equivalent of those, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, and Ministry of Climate and Environment, there's so much happening. The problem is that those initiatives or this work are not speaking with each other, or once they meet each other, there is this tendency to think of, I see the other as a threat, not as a complementary part of what I'm working on. And I see Rene raising his hand. Thank you for that, and thank you for being active with listening. So that would be my first point, right? There's so much happening, and now the question is, and I guess everybody's answer to that might be and will be different depending on the context. We need to do more in terms of innovating and building stuff that is not there, and in terms of connections, right? And then principle of subsidiarity. Some of the things have to be done at the farmer level, because like, let's not lose the major point in this conversation, which is we are not talking about voluntary carbon markets for the sake of voluntary carbon markets. We are talking about farmers adapting to climate change and mitigating climate change to the extent they can, making money in that process, and delivering ecosystem services, both protecting those as well as enhancing those ecosystem services. And I don't know how the industry side will look like in terms of emissions, whether we will always be emitting when we are flying and you will have to be offsetting that, or maybe one day you will not be, like, industry will not be emitting a lot, and we are no longer talking about offsets but just carbon removals, because as society we place value on getting the carbon debt out of the atmosphere somewhere, including through carbon removal technologies, the nature-based solutions, and climate engineering, geoengineering, whatever. So I don't know what the specific pathway will be, but there's plenty of things happening right now, and recognizing that is I think step number one, and not alienating or approaching anyone from the perspective of bad intentions, right? You have bad intentions because you are a big business. You have bad intentions because you are using glyphosate on your production. Yeah, I mean, give me an alternative solution that is cost competitive, and I will use it, right? Yeah, and I could go on and go on and go on. I will just say at the end, once again, including myself, keep it simple, right? Like, those topics are connected, but they are simple. And the moment we start complicating, it's very easy to get off track, which I saw happening a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of to go in that general line, like so much is already there. There's so much information out there, and so many things have also been figured out. So the work that we've been doing over the last years, we're very happy to talk about that, very happy to share about that. So if there are other actors that are interested in sort of working with regenerative agriculture and the carbon markets and find it slightly confusing, happy to talk it through, happy to receive contacts in that direction. I would like to start handing it over to questions, because we have a lot of them, but maybe just sort of final 2-3 sentences per person. If there are companies in the audience, if there are representatives of companies in the audience that would like to participate in the sort of regenerative agriculture transition through the carbon markets as buyers, what would be things that you would recommend them to look at? Maybe shall we start again with Nevi?
So the question is, what should, if there are companies looking to sort of tap into those carbon credits? I mean, again, like just make sure that they're highly verified to a really strong standard. Again, I mean, there are the top verification companies like Golden Vera, but there are some evolving ones too who are specifically focused around farming projects. There's one based in the United States, and I'm forgetting the name, which is terrible, but it's working really hard to address issues of additionality as well, so that if farmers have already been doing this for a while, they can actually get credits for those carbon savings reductions and avoidances, because I think that might be a challenge, is that it has to be a new initiative or a new project. And finally, this isn't really related to your question, but I just wanted to bring it up because I do manage the World Ocean Initiative. I think we can also think about blue carbon in this conversation as well, and aquaculture as sort of part of the holistic, like regenerative agricultural or food production system, and the blue carbon market is another evolving, like rapidly evolving voluntary market space that I think it's also connected and can complement these conversations really nicely.
Absolutely, such an interesting space. Thank you very much, Matteo. What would you say?
Yeah, if you are, and I hope you are, a business that is looking into this, before you send any money to farmers, visit them and have a conversation, right? And don't treat this topic as, if I may ask you, don't treat this topic as, I want to buy 1,000 tons of offsets, give me the offsets now, those are the money. Even though money are super important and like show the money, but before you will be paying the farmers, visit them and have this conversation that we are having right now. And hopefully, because I know not every business is able to have this luxury of spending time and resources on that, but like if you have the means and resources, spend them on engaging with the farmers, with all the intermediaries that you have or will have in that project or process, and keep it simple, but don't reduce it to just a financial relationship, because I think we agree we are talking about changing a system here, and we hope, and that's what we are trying to do. I know that's what you are trying to do, Ivo, that's what we are trying to do. We want one of the tools that works for this system change are voluntary carbon markets. And they hold this potential. They might not actually do that if we don't get it right. We are here to get it right, right? So visit the farmer, very simple ask.
Great point. Sort of go beyond just sort of buying the carbon and change the system in terms of rebuilding the relationships to the soil, to the farm. Such a great point. Okay, let's give time for sort of questions. Esther, I think you've been observing the chat, and it looks like there's been a great conversation going on there already. So I'm curious, have all the questions been answered already by somebody else, or any
no?
left for us?
I think we still have some open ones, and maybe we can tap onto the additionality or the permanence question. So Taylor says that permanence has been described as an unattainable goal that is creating noise within the overall discussion, and is curious to know how we can get past the concept of permanence to create a better metric, and whether this is possible in the first place.
Interesting one. Curious, what are your thoughts?
I had a little bit of internet connection issues. The question is, what are our thoughts on permanence and additionality, or only permanence, or?
No, let me repeat. So Taylor says that permanence has been described as an unattainable goal that is creating noise within the overall discussion. And she's curious to know how we can get past the concept of permanence to create a better metric, and whether this is possible in the first place.
Nelly, would you like to go first, or should I go first?
I'm gonna let you take that question,
Okay.
because I don't think it's such an important question, and honestly I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah. So my quick thoughts on this one is, permanence is a very powerful concept. Like, you do have two principles in this when you are talking about carbon credits as such, right? You have principle of additionality, and once you comply with that, you are talking about principle of permanence. And I would definitely not be saying let's forget our principle of permanence and assume like all will be nice and rosy, because of course it won't, right? If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. At the same time, indeed, especially looking at climate from a little bit higher perspective, when we are talking about feedback loops, you may have situations in which you are a regenerative farmer doing all the right things, and you should be sequestering carbon, but like, because average temperature is increasing or whatever happens, you are actually releasing carbon from your soil, because climate that you are in has such a big impact on you that, like, yeah, you are at the mercy of the climate, which means we should be taking action even sooner and greater to greater extent to mitigate and adapt. And I think this question is one of the questions. This question of what is the concept beyond permanence is one of those questions we should be saying. I at least want to be saying it is a tremendous question. I don't know the answer to that question. Let's not park it, but like, let's keep it in our list of questions to be explored as we go along. And now let's work with what we have, right? And what we have is a concept of carbon credit, which has to be additional and permanent, which is creating a lot of challenges, because with CAP, really, it's like I'm seeing very little additional actions, right? Truly from additionality point of view, which is a challenge, and that also should be one of those questions to be looked into as we are developing this convergence between voluntary carbon markets and regulation that is coming. Yeah, and I would stop here, because I think those are the major things to say.
And I think this is a great point to explore that further also in future panels. I think a couple of ideas about this from our side. Basically, if we look at nature-based solutions, and we know that from reforestation is only successful if you take the human stakeholder into account. If you take the local communities, the trees will only stand as long as the human stakeholder has an interest in them, for good or for bad. The same thing goes for agriculture. So we cannot expect carbon to stay in the ground if the farmer has no interest in it. And obviously the farmer does have an interest for it, but the farmer also needs to sort of agree, or need to have taken that decision to build their farm on that principle of increasing sort of natural resources. So what basically, when we say high quality certificates, what we also include there is sort of the farmer benefit, and the farmer benefit for us is really reflected in farm resilience, sort of also the economic resilience, because regenerative agriculture, from everything we see, is more profitable at the end of the day if it is done well. And so the point is not just this, create a 10-year contract in which carbon is captured and then, sort of do whatever you want. Of course, I mean, do whatever you want by all means, but I would hope that what you want is to maintain a healthy and profitable farm. So let's take this time frame of 10 years to improve the farm resilience and make sure that it's an integrated part, because having carbon in your soil is good for agriculture. And so I think this is really it. So the only way to maintain permanence in natural systems is to make sure that the human stakeholder has an interest in it.
Can I jump in there for a second, because I think you're so right, and it reminds me so much of conversations we've been having around a just transition and what that actually means. And I think it almost like you have to bake in just transition principles if, say, you're a massive commercial farmer who's been doing something the same way forever, and it would actually take quite a significant investment to switch to something different, like regenerative agriculture. And it goes back to Matthias's point, is just talking to the farmer, and it's almost like we can't ignore that sort of that social and just transition part of this conversation when talking about carbon markets and all of this. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that absolutely spot on, I think. Let's see, Esther.
Yeah, we have another question that goes quite well here, from Mike, who says he's with the Iowa Farmers Union, and Iowa has 24 million acres in corn and soy, but only 5% is in cover crops. Most of the cover crops are terminated with glyphosate instead of manual termination. Should those farmers who use glyphosates be eligible for the same carbon credits as the truly regenerative farmers who don't use glyphosate?
I think,
happy to
Matthias,
go first.
I would expect that from the outcome-based perspective. Your thoughts on that?
Yes. Of course, Iowa is not in the EU, right? And like at the EU level, we when we talk about sustainability, we think about organic as the end goal, which regenerative agriculture might take you to organic form. But it's very important from farmers' perspective to have the toolbox of, that glyphosate, for example, when you need it, in which case you are, of course, not organic any longer because you've applied this glyphosate, and maybe you have to go through transition period once again. So what I think I'm saying is two things. One, from my perspective, of course, yes, you should be eligible for carbon payments if you are using glyphosate, because you're making this decision. Hey, like, am I tilling or am I doing glyphosate application because I'm optimizing for soil carbon maintenance and enhancement? And okay, the question is whether you do have this choice, right? And with the trends that we are seeing in Europe, that choice might be not there for many of the farmers, which, if we agree this is what we want to do, amazing. But if we simply say to the farmers, you cannot use glyphosate, in a process that is not participatory or ends up not being participatory, I know a lot of other farmers, including the farmers in this webinar, have a very big problem with that, and rightly so, right? The question is how you don't abuse glyphosate, because it is abused, right? You shouldn't be desiccating your crops with glyphosate as we do every year to have easier harvest. We are doing that by large. What are our authorities doing with that, right? Like, what about our self-control, right? And then we are worried, like, not worried, but surprised with side effects. So once again, there's a lot being done, there's a lot to be done. And I didn't mention that in discussion so far, but role of farmer representation, it's so important, right? Extension on one hand, but also farmer representation, both lobbying to the authorities, but even more important, lobbying within the farmers' constituency, because we do have tremendous farmers among the farmers group. We do have a lot of average farmers who are looking for becoming better, profitable, more environmentally friendly, and so on. And we have some bad apples, right? And this is kind of a big elephant in the room. And they might be bad apples because they choose doing that, or they don't care, or whatever. I don't go into details, but there's that work to be done as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think super important question, super big question as well, that is being discussed a lot. And I think Lucas gave a nice answer in the chat, which is we know by now that glyphosate does not help the regenerative effect. Not really a surprise. So if we can take that into account into our calculations, or once sort of our technology is at the point where we can properly measure the outcomes, this is going to be reflected in any case. Thank you so much, everybody. We're really looking forward to having you in the next conversation. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Nelly. Thank you, Esther. And I wish you a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.